Hi everyone. So I'll be making a video today under the title, What's Wrong with Contemporary Literature? I got an idea to do this. It was a suggestion in my Discord channel. I just asked, hey, anyone interested in any particular video? And this idea was presented. It comes out of, in the last few years, 4 years or so, I've been in a process of, what would you say, like just reflecting more on the books that I own and the books that I read. And in that process, the category of books that I've gotten rid of the most would fall under contemporary literature. Things written after 1950, I would say, is kind of contemporary literature. I've kept almost none of it. And there were some times where, I sold like 100 books or traded in 100 books, and, 80 to 90 of them were contemporary literature. And part of what precipitated that is that I realized I kept reading contemporary literature or attempting to read it, and I kept being unsatisfied by it. And I think quite a few people have this feeling. And of course, it is something you can see throughout time, where the older someone gets, the more likely they are to say that, oh, things today are not nearly as good as they were when I was young, or something like that. And you'll even have some people who, one that comes to mind is Charles Doty, who was born in the 1840s, but he thought that things written during the Elizabethan period were the best, and he himself wrote in that style. There are always people like that. But I think there's something especially wrong with contemporary literature, and there's an asterisk on that statement. Contemporary literature written in English. I think that's where the problem is. And I think there are a couple reasons why there's an issue there. Like why we have this problem that we're suffering through right now. So what I'm going to do in this video will be give you a couple reasons why I think there's an issue, why there is no good writing, no quality writing being published in the English language today, and in the last few decades, where the problem came from. And then I'm going to show some contemporary literature that is excellent. It's just that none of it was written in English originally. It was translated into English. All right, so where do I think the problem stems from? So I think there are two main reasons why contemporary literature is of poor quality, appeals to almost no one. So the first issue I'll go into is a kind of cultural, it has a cultural origin, okay? I think that one of the main issues with contemporary, you might call it art writing that like consciously tries to be quality. Its main goal is not to make money. Its main goal is to be an artistic work or an artistic product that other people can get joy or, fulfillment, or have their life affirmed, or feel a sense of empathy and connection with fellow people. I think those are really, kind of a quick run through the goals of what makes something a work of art, as opposed to what makes something a, commodity that, we buy and sell and all this kind of thing. So what is the issue? I think the issue comes from a strand of modernist writing that creates an atomized literary culture. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, modernism was my favorite time period. Now, I say was, I still love it. I still love it to no end, but I couldn't confidently say it's my favorite time period now. But for a few years, I was really only reading modernist literature. Ranging from the early modernists, which would be, W.B. Yeats, or I don't know, Paul Valéry, or a handful of other people, to the high modernist period. Then you'd have, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Juna Barnes, Hart Crane. If we broaden this globally, we'll get Cesar Vallejo. I'm just looking at my shelves now. Fernando Pessoa, Nikos Kazantzakis, James Joyce, Robert Musil, Herman Broch. The list goes on. And then you have, arguably like late modernist writing. You'd have people like Basil Bunting, Samuel Beckett, Miklos Senkouthi, João Guimarães Rosa, Marguerite Young, and again, the list goes on. Arno Schmidt, I think you could put in there. And one of the things that I loved about modernism, that I still love about modernism, is that it wasn't content with just making something new or original or unique in the kind of naive sense. What the great modernists did was, as much as possible, grasp as many global literary traditions as possible, that you could actually connect with and feel, and intuit, and incorporate those into literature of the time, of the time that the artist was living in. And this applies to music, painting, etc. And the great modernists did this. When you look at people like, T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Cesar Vallejo, the list goes on, people I just mentioned, but in the previous, kind of rattling off of names, they all did this. They appealed to world traditions in a way that spoke to the time that they lived in. And there's a branch of modernism, though, into what people call postmodernism. I would make the argument that postmodernism never happened, and it was kind of like a deteriorated modernism that is what people call postmodernism, a kind of branch of failed modernism. And then I would argue we're still living fully in a modernist period. We haven't extended beyond it yet. But nonetheless, even if you don't follow that, I think my point still stands that there's a branch of modernist / postmodernist writing that became extremely atomized, or you could argue narcissistic. And I think, unfortunately, I have to throw an artist under the bus by giving an example, but I think a really good example is the tradition that came out of Ezra Pound's cantos. So, regardless of all of Ezra Pound's insanity in his life, the fascist, behavior and just stupidity, if we just look at the cantos on its own, what is it? Okay, it started out as like an expansive modern epic, beginning with Homer, beginning with the first work in Western literature. And then it was written over a period of like 50 years, and it expanded. It expanded into including, very quickly it was troubadour stuff, and then Enlightenment, American founding fathers stuff, and the Renaissance, and the Medicis, and Chinese, and all sorts of stuff. But I think the further the poem goes on, the more self-centered it gets, where the best way to understand the poem is not to necessarily read it more closely or read it more slowly or read it in connection to other works of the time or whatever. It's to read Ezra Pound's biography and to read letters he wrote and to read what he was reading at the time that he wrote the cantos. For a variety of reasons, this is backed up by many mistakes he makes in his references to all sorts of classical allusions, and his Chinese stuff is just totally just messed up. And what that means is that a reading of the classics won't get you there. Meaning like a reading of the English classics or world classics won't get you to understand the cantos in its fullest. The only thing, and knowing what happened in the 20th century, living through the same time that Ezra Pound did, won't get you there either. What will get you there is understanding Ezra Pound. That's what will allow you to understand the cantos. And I think the only thing that saves the cantos from this to be totally damning is that he does refer to world traditions. The tradition of the language it was written in English, but also, Latin and Greek. And then you have, he was pretty broad in his references. That's the only thing that saves it, in my mind, from being totally atomized and narcissistic. Now, you have a branching off point with the cantos. There were many authors who were inspired by the cantos, especially by the time you get to the 50s, 60s, 70s. You get things like A by Zhukovsky, which I think has less of the good and more of the bad that the cantos has. You get other figures that, again, I would say build this kind of narcissistic trend where even if you've been a deep reader of the tradition of English language literature or French literature, Spanish, or broader Arabic, Chinese, the poetry is extremely opaque or totally not understandable unless you read that author's specific canon. And that developed into, maybe you'd say a hegemony of certain MFA professors telling their students to read this, that, this, and that. And if you read those things, then you're on the inside and you're cool to get published and your writing is good. But if you're anywhere outside of this complex, whether because you're a kind of an average person who doesn't have access to it, doesn't read a whole lot, or because you don't accept this kind of self-centered narcissistic canon that developed out of, I would argue, a misunderstanding of what modernism was doing, you're out. You're out of the culture that is acceptable to be published and to be read and this kind of thing. Also, there's a kind of social network going on. You're friends with this person. They're hired as an editor of this journal. They publish your poetry because you're friends, not because your poetry's good. Then you can say, hey, I was published here. Here's a book manuscript. Oh, okay, we'll actually look at it because you were published. If you weren't published by your friend, we wouldn't look at it, etc., etc. That's always been the case to some degree. I think it's an especially bad situation right now, and I'll go into my second reason why in a second here. So there develops this kind of, this kind of arcane language that is both disconnected from the tradition of English language literature, but also disconnected from any kind of broad scope of world literature. I could rattle off names of this canon, but just like if you apply to an MFA program, what you have to read in there is it. Maybe like New Yorker authors or people published in Poetry Foundation since 1970 or whatever. And I would argue that what has been focused on is low quality literature in and of itself. So the canon, the enforced canon in these circles that then leads to network connections in publishing is a poor quality canon. So whether that's a mistake or on purpose, whatever, I'll say it's a mistake. People didn't know what they were doing, so they enforced a low quality, kind of narcissistic canon. And then we get low quality writing out of that, low quality, self-centered narcissistic writing. Maybe the perfect example of that would be someone like Ocean Vuong or Sally Rooney or what else? I think those are good examples. Jordan Castro, the novelist. I mean, his book titled The Novelist. These kinds of things are extremely self-centered books. And so that's a cultural thing. Now, what's the second reason? The second reason connects with the fact that the US economy is gradually disintegrating. Wealthy people are sucking up more of the wealth, more of the total wealth and the relative wealth. And so what that means is reading, which is arguably the pastime or the recreation or the art form that takes the most developed attention span to actually engage with. So you have technology that's stealing people's attention, destroying their attention span to make more money. Okay, so that's one of the assaults on this. So less people are reading, I think, arguably. Now there might be a resurgence where younger people are revolting against this horrifying state of affairs and deciding to cultivate their attention span and actually read more without secondary enhancements like meth or Adderall or things like this. They're actually just developing their mind. I don't know if there's a full revolt though against that. But the main thing is that who reads books? Okay. There's a race to the bottom dynamic with publishers because, of course, a publisher where there's less money to go around has an even bigger commandment or call to make profit then because there's less grants, there's less this and that. Okay. Less people are spending money on books. Okay. So if we publish something, it has to make money. It has to be profitable. So immediately you're getting a limitation of diversity. You're getting a limitation of, voices and perspectives because the voices and perspectives and the diversity has to appeal to the largest amount of people. If we're taking in an English language context here. Okay, we know that Americans and people in the UK and Canadians as a group don't read translated literature. If you look at the proportions of works originally written in English to translated literature, it's a vanishingly small number. of books that are translated are, bestsellers or at the top of lists or whatever. So that means that translated works are not going to be read. So what that also means is that if you're writing a book in English, why would you refer to anything that has been translated or anything outside of the given culture, the given English language like pop culture? Your readership won't understand it, because your readership has to be the average, has to be the lowest common denominator of awareness of other cultures, of kind of broadest acceptable pop culture awareness, this kind of thing. And so even if there are people who are writing works that appeal to a pretty small audience, which, inevitably there are, those are not going to be published by major publishers. We're not going to get a Recognitions published by, who published it? Knopf for JR, and then Harcourt for the Recognitions. We're not getting that, obviously. And we haven't gotten that. And that's a big deal. That's a huge deal. But even so, what if we say, but small presses will put out good stuff? Well, I think one of the issues there, you go back to our kind of cultural problem where literature that is empathetic is not cool. You have to write about yourself. You're not allowed to write about anyone else. You have to be staring at a mirror deeply to write anything and get it published. And then also, the contemporary publishing field is, what would you say, like it's fully stocked with people who also haven't read anything. Now, there are a few publishers who have read. A lot of them tend to be like kind of neo-modernist kind of things like Contramundum or Black Sun Lit. Handful of, interesting publishers that are really doing interesting stuff, that publish, actually contemporary writing, originally written in English. But it's really a small number. All of the most interesting independent presses publish translated stuff. Their best stuff is new translated stuff. And that gives me even more evidence that there's something deeply broken with English language literary culture. And I haven't quite exactly dialed it in, but I think these two reasons, the cultural break where referring to anything, traditionally or, of the past is unacceptable, but also referring to anything around the world is unacceptable. So you have to be like almost impressively self-centered to write a book. And then also the monetary force that's like pushing down what people are able to do, because it's not like publishers are looking for, hey, we know our average reader base will recognize quality, let's just look for quality. It'll be maybe identity stuff related to identity. It might be things related to pop culture sensibility. So, will this famous person like this book, and then they'll get all their followers to buy it, or something like that. And advertising is a big part of all this, but I won't go into that now. I think I've gone on long enough for the what's wrong. Two possible counterpoints I anticipate that I'll quickly rebut. Okay. Haven't people always said this? Haven't people always said, oh, things are bad now, things are way better in the past? Yes, but I think it's often older people who say this. It's not often that it's people, in their 20s who recognize that everything written at their time is of a very low quality in their language. But in other languages, there's high quality stuff being written. That's a very unusual thing. That's very unusual. I'd be curious if anyone knows of an example of that. um, it would be unlikely to be published. So yes, but no. And as a corollary to that, I looked back at the earliest issues of Poetry magazine. It started in what, 1913, 1914, something like that. And I read through maybe 10 years of issues just straight, reading beginning to end. And I did that because I wanted to see, like, okay, how much bad stuff was actually being put out, where now you just know proofrock or this poem or that poem or whatever. Yeah, there was a lot of low quality stuff being put out. But when you do stumble across proofrock, you're blown away. It's immediate that you recognize this is great. This is great. And you don't need to be told that. You recognize that in other poets too. There's a hierarchy. There's like, okay, they just published this because they need to fill space or they were friends with somebody. And then you can say, oh wow, this is a fascinating poem here. Oh, the author just didn't write anything else. Oh, what a shame. If they had written more, published more, they would have been a really interesting author. And then you get someone like T.S. Eliot, who is already the best at the time and then kept publishing and became better over time. I argue we don't have that happening today. We don't have the, oh, wow, this is really promising, that kind of feeling. And so I think that's one argument you can make, like, all times have had mostly bad stuff. Yes, but we don't have any good to balance out the bad, is my argument there. And then, oh, well, people have always said this. People have always said, oh, everything's bad now, things are good in the past. Yes, but I think it's like mostly older people who are maybe disconnected from the times or genuinely have already found enough good stuff and don't need to read any new stuff. But I think the thing that gets around that is that there is good stuff being written, it's just not in English. So if, like, for example, if I can recognize that there is good literature being written contemporaneously, it's just not in my native language, that means there's an issue with the culture in my native language, not of the world today or something like that, which I think is the implication. It's like a hyper-conservative thing, or whatever. All right, well, I mean, that's not like a comprehensive discourse on the issue, I would say, but I think it gets the conversation started, and I'd be curious if anyone disagrees with me or in a substantive way, or agrees but thinks I've missed something. I'd be curious to see what you think. So this last chunk of the video, I will be sharing with you what I think are the best contemporary works of literature. Contemporary, I'll take that to mean, normally my kind of intuitive sense is like anything after World War II feels contemporary. It feels very recent. But to make it more in line with what people mean generally with contemporary, I'll take it books published in the last 15 years. Or like, if it includes something that was written in the last 15 years, so books of poetry that are, collections or whatever. So that'll be my constraint. Excellent works of literature written in the last 15 years, so since 2010 or so. The closest book in English that would fit that would be The Easy Chain by Evan Dara. I think that's the best work of prose or poetry written, like, that's the most recent excellent one. I do think The Lost Scrapbook is a better book, but I think Easy Chain is excellent as well. Unfortunately, I have not found the same quality in Evan Dara's recent books, The Mohicans or Permanent Earthquake. Also Flee. I don't know what's happening, but I think there's a drop off in quality for some reason of those last three. I don't know if Evan Dara is too busy with something, or writing is just kind of like a side affair or something like that. But anyway, that's what I would present as, yes, there is still good stuff being written in English, but It's by literally a pseudonym author that is self-published. I mean, that is truly damning for what's going on in the English language. In contrast, I will start with a book I just picked up and just read and was blown away by, and that is Zheng Xiaoqiang, who is a contemporary Chinese poet, born in 1980. Okay, so genuinely contemporary. And rather than give you a description, I'm just going to read one of her poems. And this was translated by Eleanor Goodman. Excellent figure to keep your eye out for. Pay attention to what Eleanor Goodman is putting out. She's an amazing translator of contemporary Chinese literature. I have a handful of her other books. All right. So this poem I'm going to read. Let me figure out exactly here. This is from the 2012. This is from a book of poetry titled Woman Worker, of course in Chinese, from 2012. And the title is Kneeling Workers Demanding Their Pay. The women flash by like ghosts at bus stops, machine stations, industrial zones, filthy rented rooms, their thin bodies like razor blades, like white paper, like strands of hair, like the air. They use their fingers to slice, iron, film, plastics. They're exhausted, numb. Faces are like ghosts. They're installed in machine stations, work uniforms, assembly lines. Their bright gazes, young ages, they hide in their self-constructed dark tidal currents. I can't tell them apart anymore, just like no one can tell me apart from them. Leftover, leathery bodies, motion, blurred faces, one after another, innocent faces. They're constantly put together, arranged into an electronics factory, ant's nest, a toy factory, hive. They laugh, stand, kneel, bend, huddle. They've been simplified down to fingers and thighs. They've become tightened screws, sliced iron sheets, compressed plastic, bent aluminum wire, cut cloth. They're expressions of disappointment, pride, exhaustion, happiness, chaos, helplessness, loneliness. They come from villages, hamlets, valleys, neighborhoods. They're smart, clumsy, timid, weak. Today they kneel, facing the big, bright window, the black uniformed guards, the lustrous cars, the green bushes. The factory sign shines bright in the sun. They kneel at the factory entrance, holding a cardboard sign with the scrawled words, "Give us our hard-earned money." The four women kneel in the factory entrance without fear. The onlookers around them a few days ago were village acquaintances, co-workers, friends, or work in the same machines. They watch the kneeling women impassively. They witness their four co-workers dragged off by the guards. They witness one of the workers' shoes falling off. They witness another worker's pants ripped in the struggle. They watch silently. As the four workers are dragged somewhere far away, their eyes hold no sorrow and no pleasure. They impassively enter the factory, and their misfortune depresses me no end. Yeah. Just extremely striking. Just extremely striking. So Zheng Xiaoqiang, she was one of these factory workers, known as a migrant worker poet. There's a genre of this in contemporary Chinese writing now, and you got a feeling for her poetry there. But one of the other impressive things is that she deftly fits into the 3,000-year tradition of Chinese poetry, which I can say because I've done some reading in it, and it's remarkable. It's remarkable how someone like her, her poetry on its own is excellent, but then knowing that she herself was an undereducated factory worker, the largest mass migration in human history are these migrant workers coming from rural parts of China, 200 to 300 million people. That's larger than the refugee crises around World War II. And it's like in the United States where people without documentation are taken advantage of, and it's used as a political tool and an economic pawn. In China, it's done to rural workers who are not allowed to go to the cities, but their economic prospects in the rural parts of China are so depressed that they illegally go to the cities and become like just unbelievably exploited workers. And of course, the background of all this is that, every time in the United States you see a Made in China sticker or something like that, you know that someone like Zheng Jiaochang is being taken advantage of and abused to create that tchotchke, or that meaningless object that you didn't need in the first place, that you just had to buy, this kind of thing. So yeah. Here's another one, a poem called To Give. I've endured the fading away of gentle youth. For many years life has been like a dulled word. I've been revising. I try to study, love, hate, forgetting old desires, grow withered, get stranded, and so on. But I've met with expansive sorrow, impressive as the open sea, a bright, flickering ache halting inside a tiny needle hole. Just like unreal, just unreal. So anyway, I'll hold that there for a second. In the Roar of the Machine, literally just published this month by NYRB. I'll go quickly through these other ones. All right, another world-class Chinese poet that is publishing today is Shi Chuan, and this is translated by Lucas Klein. He's another figure to keep an eye out for. If Lucas Klein translates something, it's worth reading. Shi Chuan, he was born in 1963, so he's a little older, but still absolutely contemporary. This book was published in 2022 by New Directions. And yeah, just amazing stuff. And Shi Chuan is fully fluent in, the Chinese tradition, but the entirety of the Western tradition. He'll refer to Confucius and Heidegger in the same poem, deftly, not just name dropping. And the amazing thing about this, it's also bilingual. So strongly recommended. Bloom by Shi Chuan. All right, so that covers the one part of the world. Now another part of the world that I would say must be mentioned is the Middle East. Now, Adonis is getting up there in years. He's 95 years old. He was born in 1930. No, that doesn't make sense. He was born in Yes, that is correct. That is correct. He's born in 1930, and he's 95 years old. This is Adonis, in English it'd be like Adonis, Selected Poems. This is published by Yale, the Margelos series, which is also an excellent publisher of work in translation. I won't read off any of his poems, but I would argue the greatest living poet in any language. And I was very fortunate I decided to, but I also got to teach his poetry to my high school students this past year. And it's really, really remarkable. So, Adonis. He's originally from Syria, but he's lived in France for the last decades. All right. And then I will also be sharing two authors that hail from Latin America. And write in Spanish, but also can write in English, interestingly enough. So firstly, I talked about this author on this channel, Benjamin Labatut. This is, I think, his best book, The Maniac. It was just published in 2023. Yep, 2023. Yeah, I think he is writing about things that truly actually matter to maybe everyone on this earth, and very few writers in the English language are doing that. So, excellent, excellent. And last, but certainly not least, we have one of my favorite contemporary writers, Valeria Luiselli. This is her first novel, Faces in the Crowd. I was happy to get a signed copy. It was signed to Malcolm, so I'm just going to change my name to Malcolm. But yeah, from 2016, so signed this 9 years ago. And that's about when I got interested in Luiselli. This book is from 2012, the translation. I probably got interested in her books, yeah, maybe 2015, maybe 2015. I read this, and then I read The Story of My Teeth. Then I read Sidewalks. I have not read Lost Children Archive. I have read the Tell Me How It Ends, the essay collection, but I have not read Lost Children Archive, which, if I remember correctly, she wrote in English. Pretty sure she wrote that one in English. So anyway, her artwork she's working on currently that I will bring to attention again is Echoes from the Borderlands. I was fortunate enough to go up to Dallas, and they made an hour-long trailer of the 24-hour art piece that they're making. 12 hours is done so far. It's 24 hours long for a variety of reasons. That's the amount of time it takes to travel from the ocean off of San Diego to the Gulf of Mexico off of Texas. It's also the number of books in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and so on and so on. But it was extremely affecting to be there and to hear and see this work of art. So they're now working on the Texas branch. They've already recorded from the Pacific Ocean to the Rio Grande River, and now they're at their most challenging part, which is the U.S.-Mexico border along the border of Texas. So those are the authors that I think are putting out excellent work. It's just that none of them write in English, Although Labatut and Luiselli do write in English. It's maybe somewhat paradoxical, but anyway. All right, well, that's that video. Let me know what you think. And yeah, death is a gang boss.